Thank you so much for Thank you so much for coming this evening. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your career in medicine so far?
I certainly can. Good evening. And before I do so, I just want to start with saying thank you, firstly, to Luke and the team for setting up such a great event this evening, and also to all of you guys for joining on a sort of wet Wednesday evening to learn a bit more and talk a bit more about leadership. It'd be great to sort of hear a little bit more about you as well, just briefly in the chat. So I'm going to pop in there. I'm Liam. I'm a GP trainee. I'm based in Cambridge. It'd be great to sort of hear about where you're based around the country, and what sort of stage of your medical student career you're at. So it'd be great if you could pop that in chat. So Luke, you asked, could I tell me a bit about sort of myself, my career in medicine? So firstly, I've just turned 30. So I'd like to say I'm not that much further along the journey than many of you, I hope. It was sort of only about 5 years ago that I left medical school. And I remember sort of very fondly coming to events like this when I was a junior doctor, when I was a medical student. So it's great to sort of come back and speak at one of these. I kind of got into medicine really for the kind of things that people say at interview. Like, I genuinely just wanted to do something good and wanted to help people. I didn't have any doctors in my family. I didn't have many people in my family at all who'd really been to university. So this kind of came about from, okay, I'm reasonable at science. I want to do something good. I kind of fell into sort of medicine from that perspective. I trained at Oxford, so I spent 6 years there as a medical student, had such a wonderful time. Alongside that, started developing some of this leadership side of things, which at the time I didn't really recognize as leadership, something we might come on to this evening. So I had a great time there and then moved over to Liverpool, which is a little bit closer to home for me. So I spent F1, F2 working in sort of central Liverpool hospitals and GP practices for my first sort of 2 years as a doctor. And since then, about sort of 3 years ago now, I've moved to Cambridge to start GP training. I sort of realized that in terms of specialty, GP was probably for me, which is for a number of reasons, again, which we might come on to this evening. So sort of settled down here in Cambridge, currently working 3 days a week as a GP trainee. I'm doing clinical work, and 2 days a week, essentially doing some of this leadership work, which I've no doubt we will come on to shortly. So that's a brief sort of intro to me, and great to see everyone in the chat. We've got a range of medical student years and junior doctors throughout the country. So wonderful, welcome. Great to spend the evening with you.
Awesome, that's so good to hear. I feel like I'm one of those people where I just put on my personal statement, I like helping people, it's just a thing, but I think Liam here actually fully committed to the cause. How did you first become involved in leadership and management?
That's a really good question, and it's one that's sort of quite often asked in these areas. And what I hear back is quite consistent from leaders through to the top leaders in the country when we ask them this. And it is almost at first, you don't sort of choose to be a leader. You don't like, oh, I really want to do leadership specifically. It just comes from a sort of drive and a desire to actually just want to make the things around you a little bit better. So trying to sort of look back to say when I was a medical student, I was quite interested in what was happening around me, the sort of the student union that we had at the time, and how that run things like events, societies and things like this. And I was like, oh, that's all really good. I'm quite keen to get involved in that sort of thing, and try and make those better, try and run good things, make good things happen. And at the time, you don't really sort of notice that as leadership, so to speak. It doesn't come with a big badge or a big hat that says, oh, I'm a leader now, I've got one of these positions. It just kind of comes from wanting to go out there and do sort of make things better. As I kind of went through medical school, that sort of transformed from sort of like non-clinical leadership, as I talk about like lots of sort of student societies, president of the Med School Society, things like this, through to as I became a junior doctor, particularly in F1, F2, wanted to apply some of these leadership skills to more patient-based work. And that generally came around from just looking around me, spotting things that weren't happening as well as they should, or patients weren't getting the care that they should, or teams weren't working as effectively as they could, and thinking, you know what, I'm quite keen to do something about this. I'm quite keen to take this on and get involved. And that was everything really, from in my ward. When I was on psychiatry, we weren't measuring patient observations maybe in the way that we could do more effectively. So I can work with a bit of a team here. I can do something on that. Through to when I was in GP practices, we seemed to work in an area of where we had a lot of patients who would book appointments but wouldn't attend those appointments. So some thinking at sort of practice level around, oh, well, what can we do here? Like, what can we learn about why this is happening, and what can we change in terms of our practices to make this less of an issue? And so it kind of sort of grew organically through that route, if I'm honest, just from looking around, wanting to make things better, and then just cracking on and trying to do some of that. Then all of a sudden you start working with people and you start recognizing that, yes, actually you leading some of these things is leadership, and you can start putting a label on that and say, well, I'm doing a leadership project here, or I'm developing a specific leadership skill to help me with this. And then that can almost then go through to taking on specific leadership roles. So fellowships are a really good example at junior doctor leadership roles, where you'll soon see when you qualify, these exist as sort of 1 day a week, 2 day a week posts, right the way through to full-time posts, where you can take time out of your direct clinical work to think about the things that are happening around you and how you might improve them. And to me, that is essentially what leadership is, looking around and making things better. And that's really kind of how I got involved.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, I think one thing that really struck out to me was when I started working, I noticed how the NHS wasn't functioning as a super efficient box, and there were things where things could be improved. And I think leadership starts at a very early stage. I think even as a medical student, if you see something that you think could be done better, then do try and find some people who agree, or to try and get some people on board and try and make a change. Because I think leadership isn't this medical speciality. It's not like cardiology or rheumatology. It's a continuous process, and if you find it's a skill that you can learn, a bit like communication skill that comes with you every stage in your career. So Liam, did you face any significant challenges in the early stages of medical leadership, and how did you overcome these?
Good question. I think the honest answer to that is probably plenty. There were a few things, but one that I would sort of focus on would be, so as a med student, as a junior doctor, you've got a lot of things competing for your time. You've got your exams, you've got your placements, and you've hopefully got plenty of going on outside of medicine as well. As a result, I felt a lot of the time as a med student and as a junior doctor, my time and energy were pretty limited. To be honest, and kind of all of this sort of leadership work that I was doing would often be extra. So you wouldn't necessarily have time carved out in your week. You didn't have a 1 day a week fellowship post or anything like this to dedicate time to. Instead, you were trying to fit it in alongside everything that's happening already. And that can be quite challenging. And you really don't want that to be happening at the expense of some of that core stuff. So ultimately, you don't want it to be happening at the expense of being a good doctor and training to be a good doctor, because, you know, at least in these clinical spaces, in order to be a good clinical leader, I think you really need to be a good doctor too. So you don't want to be doing that at the expense, doing your leadership stuff at the expense of some of that core stuff. I did find that quite challenging, and there were times when I found like I was really keen, really passionate, really engaged, but I was taking a lot on over and above what I was doing as a med student, as a junior doctor, and that can be quite hard. In terms of sort of how you overcome that, that's something that's happened. it's quite an individual decision, and it's quite an individual decision on a day-to-day, if not week by week basis. Like, I certainly found throughout my sort of past 5 years working as a doctor, say, there are some times where I feel like I've got a lot of energy and a lot of time to do some of this. And then there are other times when I'm like, maybe I need to row back a little bit and focus a bit more on that course, so to speak. But one thing that I have found helpful throughout all of this is I often find it much easier to dedicate time and to dedicate energy to things that I'm really passionate about and things that I enjoy doing. So at the start of the sort of the leadership journey, so to speak, when you're dipping your toe into the water, you're seeing what's out there. I certainly did take a lot of opportunities that I thought, this is a really good thing for me to do. It's not necessarily in my area of interest, so to speak, but I think I would be able to contribute a lot, and I would also get a lot of learning from that. And that's quite important. But those things are a bit more challenging than the projects that come along. It's like, well, I'm really interested in tackling health inequalities at a local level. This new opportunity that's come along is really for me. I can easily dedicate a bit more time, a bit more energy to this, because ultimately it doesn't feel like work. So sort of wrapping all of that together, what does this mean for current medical students, current junior doctors? I think almost the ultimate thing would be, if you found something that you're really passionate about and there's an opportunity within that, then it's probably one you can take with both hands, and giving that extra time and energy might not feel like too much of a chore. And then even further, if that opportunity doesn't exist in that area that you're specifically interested in, then why not carve it out? Why not speak to people? Why not find a specific thing that you and maybe a team of other people could have an impact on, and then give it a go and see what happens? That's probably what I would say to that one, Luke.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a really inspiring answer. I think if there's something that really motivates you, I think that's a really powerful drive for you to overcome your challenges. And if you do have a lot going on, I think having something meaningful to do just helps you find that extra bit of energy and gives you a purpose to bring something across the line. Liam, how has your journey in medical leadership been like so far?
Good question. So I think that probably my biggest takeaway would be how much I've enjoyed it. I think don't get me wrong, I enjoy my clinical work. I work 3 days a week clinically, and I take a lot from that. But quite often, as no doubt you're seeing in a lot of your placement, things are often quite challenging in the clinical world at the moment. There's lots of pressures, particularly during COVID. It can be quite draining working sort of within those clinical roles. One thing that I found has really helped me is having that balance between my clinical work and my leadership work. So as I say, 3 days a week clinical at the moment, and then 2 days a week leadership. And I've been really fortunate for the past couple of years now to have sort of dedicated paid time within my role to do some of this leadership work. And I think the reason I say it's been so enjoyable is because it almost gives me additional energy to take back into my clinical work. And then I start my week, my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays in clinic, and I'm like, I take a lot from that I can take directly back to some of these leadership roles that I do. So there's something about how much I enjoy it, and there's something about how much they complement each other. I think for people who are interested, which everyone in the room this evening, you're here on a Wednesday evening, you're clearly interested in leadership. I think if that's something you pursue and you get the balance right, it can lead to a really sort of fulfilling but also sustainable career as well. In terms of, I guess you asked sort of what my journey's been like, and almost sort of why do I enjoy it? It comes back to that core principle of wanting to do something good and genuinely wanting to help people and try and make things better, but you're doing it through a different lens. So as a GPE trainee, I know that I sit in front of my patient, I'll see 20 or so a day. And I'd like to think I'm having a positive impact on them, the person in front of me in the consulting room. Leadership almost gives you the opportunity to take yourself out of the consulting room and recognize that you can help people. You can, yes, help the person in front of you in the room, but you can also help people more broadly. And that's about thinking about the structures that we set up, the systems that we use, what help this whole ethereal healthcare policy, like what is policy, what does that look like, and how do we shape it to create better services? Like, that's something I personally find really, really interesting. And I enjoy thinking about some of these bigger challenges so much, which is probably why I enjoy the leadership roles that I've been lucky enough to hold over the past few years. So yeah, my journey's been really interesting. It's not been sort of completely planned out, as in, oh, I'll do this week, and then in 6 months' time, I'm going to go for this job. Medical leadership doesn't work like that. It doesn't work in the same way you go F1, F2, ST1, ST2. It's a bit of a sort of winding road where you often carve out paths for yourself. But that's been a really sort of enjoyable and fulfilling thing to do.
Absolutely, no doubt. I'm having a quick look at Liam's list of previous roles here, and it's pretty inspiring. So you've been the president of the Oxford Clinical School. You were the junior doctor mess president at your hospital in the Royal Liverpool Hospital, the VTS representative, GP trainee working with Public Health England and NHS Improvement as well. Which projects have you found the most memorable? Are there any particular that you want to that you thought really interested you and sort of really inspired you to do something else?
Yeah, no, good question. Where do I start? So I think one sort of time in this sort of journey that really stands out to me was essentially last Christmas, in the lead up to last Christmas. So I was on a full-time fellowship. I was working at NHS England, so a big national organisation that's essentially responsible for sort of overseeing and delivering all of the services that exist in the country. I was working in the primary care team, so the team I was a part of had a specific responsibility for running general practice and overseeing and guiding the direction of general practice. And I'd been in this role for about sort of 3 months. And then all of a sudden, and what felt almost out of nowhere, was Omicron. Another huge wave of COVID that was peaking really quickly. As with other waves, in those first couple of weeks, there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know necessarily about what the severity is going to be, what the trajectory is going to look like. And that was really, really challenging. You were all of a sudden in this national team with a huge responsibility for trying to shape and direct and guide the services that were offered around the country in a time of particular challenge. And within that, there were lots of competing interests for it. We think about general practice specifically. So we knew the importance of vaccinating people against COVID, and we saw how there was sort of daily press conferences from the government about the need to drive up vaccination, and general practice were playing a real part of that. But we also knew from the learning throughout the rest of the pandemic that there's a lot of people with long-term conditions. They have high blood pressure, they have diabetes, and general practice is very good at managing those things as well. How do we balance all of these competing interests with a sort of workforce that's been under a lot of pressure for a lot of time, and also ultimately have a limited capacity? How do you decide where you put that national focus and try and set that national direction and try and bring over 6,000 GP practices in the country, try and bring them on the journey with you to serve over 50 million patients ultimately, and everybody in the country who's impacted one way or another by COVID? That was a huge challenge for me, and getting to see an insight into that at a national level, how one of these national teams work, was fascinating. it led to a lot of long days, a lot of long hours, a lot of time over Christmas spent working on this and trying to see what can we do to try and meet some of this challenges we're facing. But it genuinely felt like we were having an impact. It was decisions that we were making as quickly as we could at a national level to try and meet some of these challenges. We're having a real tangible impact upon what was happening on the ground. And yes, there are challenges within themselves, and working nationally, you're within certain constraints. There's only so much you can do. But it really felt like that was a particular time I look back on and think, wow, you never want anything like this to happen, of course. But to have the opportunity to try and contribute to that effort and really do all that we can as part of that team was really quite a sort of phenomenal experience, to be honest.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I can't imagine how much work you guys would have had to put in when Omicron came out. It was this big scary thing, and when the vaccines weren't really effective against it, I think having to go through all of that and implementing a policy where GPs started vaccinating people in their practices and all of the policies around it just seems like a colossal task. And I think it paid off, because I think this time, well, a lot of people got vaccinated and things like, it seems like COVID is coming back, but maybe it would be worse had that not happened. And talking about national roles and local roles, how have you found what have you noticed? What are the biggest differences you've noticed moving from leadership at a local level to a regional and then to a national level?
Great question again. I think the biggest thing that almost sort of hit me in the face as soon as I started working nationally was that complexity and the sort of escalating challenges, so to speak. So when we talk about local level, I think of that as working on a ward in a hospital, which you'll all have experience of. That there might be 50 patients a week who pass through your ward, and you have a responsibility for them. If you're in a clinical role, a leadership role, it's probably about 50 patients a week, let's call it. Then when you think about going through right the way to the other end of the spectrum, national roles, so NHS England, for example, you have a responsibility almost for every person in the public. That's over 50 million people are impacted in some way or another by the decisions that the team and the organisation make. So in general practice, for example, we do around 1.3 million appointments per day. 1.3 million people have contact with their general practice each day. That going from ward level and practice level to 1.3 million appointments per day kind of blew my mind in a way, I'll be completely honest. But I guess what have I sort of taken from that? What have I learned from that? So at a local level, whether that's in your ward, in your practice, or even in your student society, for example, it's quite often possible that if you have an idea and you're really committed to it and you want to make it happen, it's probably just about possible to make it happen on your own and to be like, okay, I'm going to push this through, I'm going to make it happen. Great. It's easier if you bring other people with you, and that's what leadership is all about, right? But at a local level, you can get things done through your own determination and through your own sort of real drive to make it happen. It's very, very clear that as soon as you start getting to anywhere much below regional, but regional and national level, you're thinking there's absolutely no way that I can do anything significant as an individual. And I think that's a really important lesson to learn. It's the only way you're going to do anything that has any impact is by bringing people with you, by being part of a team that is working towards a shared goal, that is working well together, and that has some direction as well. And that, again, it sort of hit me in the face at a national level. That is absolutely critical to success in anything that you do. I think within that, there's a really good lesson for me and everyone in the room, hopefully, that actually, if you take that approach and bring it right down to your local work and what happens in your practice or in your ward, you're going to be so much more effective by having a team who are motivated, engaged, working in the same direction. your projects at a very local level. And that doesn't need to be a team that's well defined, where everyone has a specific role and they've all got a specific job. Quite often it's just having a few cheerleaders for your work who are like, you know what, Liam, you're doing a really good job. Like, keep going. I'll advocate for you. I'll speak for you. And that can go a long way. So I think my biggest learning from working very locally to very nationally is, no matter where you are in the spectrum, having that like-minded group of people at least alongside you and who've got your back is a really powerful way to bring about some quite effective change.
That's awesome. That's frankly quite astonishing. In terms of, so you mentioned about finding the right people, how do you think would be the best way to go about doing that? How do you find people who are involved and invested in the same ideas, and how do you get them on board if they're not? And how do you move towards a common goal together?
Yeah, no, really good question. So firstly, how do you find those people around? Like, I often used to think, okay, this is a huge challenge. This is, I've got to now go out and spend time in lots of different spaces, speaking to lots of different people to try and find these people. I think ultimately I was wrong on that. The almost sort of self-selecting like-minded people are going to be the people who are spending time in the spaces that you're already in. Tonight being the perfect example, we're all brought together by a shared interest in clinical leadership, right? The people who work on your ward or in your general practice are all there to try and do what's best for your patients. Like, these spaces are bringing together like-minded people already. So rather than going out and trying to do something different, I'd say in the first instance, just look around you in the time that you spend in these places, because no doubt you'll find people there who do have shared interests and who are keen to work towards that common goal. In terms of how any sort of like skills or things like this, I think that there's no sort of magic thing. There's no like trick to leadership. It's doing things that are kind of common sense and developing and showing some of these skills that you are developing by becoming a doctor. So this is going to sound really basic and really probably cheesy in a way, but I think for me that some of the keys are really sort of being kind and being compassionate to the people who are around you and who you're working with on projects. Like, we all face our own challenges in our work life, in our personal life. We all don't fully understand what's happening in everyone else's life. So a bit of kind and compassion can actually go a long way and really say to your colleagues, oh, that's somebody I quite want to work with. Secondly, I think there's something key about listening, and that's actively listening. So that's when that's going out and seeking opinions from the people that you're working alongside. Ideally a diverse group of people who can each bring something different to the table, and asking them, what do you think about this? How would you go about this? And then following that, really having an open mind to taking on board some of the ideas and being prepared to have your mind changed by what you hear from your colleagues is a really powerful thing to do. And then I guess finally, something that I don't think we do enough in the NHS is, if you see someone's done a good job, like, tell them they've done a good job. I can remember times as a med student or as a junior doctor where I felt like I'd put all my time, all my effort into something clinical on the ward, and I'd probably do 10 things in a day that went really well, I was really pleased with. But I would do an 11th thing that wasn't quite right, or maybe I shouldn't have ordered that CLP, or maybe I shouldn't have done this. And quite often we're quick to pick up on that 11th thing, and other people are quite quick to pick up and say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? We're not that good at picking up on those 10 things that are really good. You know what? You did that great. Well done. It costs nothing. But as a leader saying that to a follower, or a team member saying that to a teammate, it can be a really powerful way to sort of build those relationships and bring people with you. So final piece here, don't be afraid to say well done when things have gone well.
Oh, that's a really great set of points there. I think, no, I can totally relate with the last one. I think it's so important to tell people who you think have done a good job. I think in medicine, especially once you start working, you've got so many things on go, and you only hear about the ones that have gone wrong when somebody pulls you up for this thing that you haven't prescribed correctly. But no, what you said before about having a few cheerleaders, you should try and become a cheerleader for people around you as well, by just motivating people and telling people when they've done a good job. I think that's such a key quality to have, and something that great leaders all share, I'm sure. Liam, so what are you currently working on in terms of your any interesting projects or any future plans?
Good question. So currently, as I say, 3 days a week GP training. I've got about a year and a half left or so of that. And that's something that's really important to me within the sort of clinical leadership space. You almost have a choice. You have a choice of being in some of these policy rooms or leadership rooms. You have a choice of being there as a clinician who's sort of practicing at the moment and can relate to the patient they saw yesterday and how that's going to impact some of this policy. Or you have a choice of taking the step out of medicine completely and being in these policy spaces as a former doctor or former medical student, but you're not there to talk about the patient you saw yesterday. You're there in a very different role. And for me, I really like this side of things. I really like being that clinician. So there's something important to me about, like I said before, about trying to be the best doctor I can be in order to then be the best leader, so to speak, that I can be. So that's important. For the other 2 days of my week, one of which I'm still working at NHS England, doing some of this national policy stuff, specifically thinking about how we can develop leadership skills amongst our next generation of GPs, of which I hope we have some in the audience this evening, because the more that we can get, the better. So doing some of that. And then finally, on my Fridays, I'm doing something a bit different. So I'm thinking about how I can try and take some of these skills I've developed, particularly at sort of national level, and really apply them to some of the things happening in my local community. So I kind of have a sort of a voluntary unpaid day on my Fridays working with some of the local charities. So the food bank, for example, and sort of aid organizations. I'm thinking about, okay, so how can I take what I've learned from healthcare and how we deliver healthcare and apply that to how some of these other organizations operate, try and bring a fresh pair of eyes, try and think about where links with healthcare would actually be really beneficial. Like you guys coming through the system now will no doubt have so much more training on the likes of the social determinants of health, the wider determinants of health, and actually what makes someone healthy isn't necessarily just the healthcare that we offer them, but more about what their housing looks like, what their education has looked like, whether they have social networks that they can fall back upon. So really trying to think about how I can take some of those skills and actually try and do something here in Cambridge in my local community that hopefully will have an impact, particularly as we're facing what will no doubt be a tough winter with COVID on the rise, with the cost of living crisis. Yeah, so trying to think a bit outside of the box, so to speak, and do something a bit different. So really enjoying that so far.
Wow, that's truly impressive. I don't know how you find the time to do all of this beyond your clinical duties as well. I certainly have to work on my time management skills. What would you say are the skills or qualities that have had the biggest impact on helping you get to where you are today?
Good question. I think I would probably come back to what I mentioned earlier about sort of being, so the three things that are key for me: being kind and compassionate, actively listening to those people around you, and also telling people when they've done a good job. There's also one other thing as well, is something that I've picked up maybe in the past year or so, which I really sort of wish I'd done sooner. And that was not being afraid to sort of reach out to other people and say hello and say, oh, I'd really like to chat to you for half an hour. Would you mind? So I kind of went through the whole of medical school and most of my first bits as a junior doctor and thinking, I'd hear someone speak at a conference, or I'd go to a webinar, or I'd just see somebody working in a practice up the road or something like this, and be like, they're doing some really great stuff. I'm really interested in what they do, but they absolutely wouldn't want to spend the time speaking to me about it. Like, they've got much better things to do. And I think that's a reasonable thought, absolutely. But something changed maybe about a year ago, maybe when I took on this national fellowship. We were really encouraged to reach out to people, whether that is the GP who works in the practice up the road, or whether that is the medical director of a ICS, integrated care system, in a region. It's I found that really challenging at first. I was like, this is so uncomfortable. I really don't like doing this. But I gave it a go once or twice, and I fired off emails or even messages on Twitter to people saying, look, I've seen what you do. I would really like to ask you more about X, Y, and Z. Can you spare 30 minutes at any point for a coffee, a virtual coffee? And what kind of really struck me is that I got a response every time, and every single time they said yes. There's lots of people out there who are really willing to give up their time and energy to support leaders like you guys, like myself, coming through the system. So I guess if there's one sort of skill, or it's not a skill, if there's one thing to sort of take away, I would certainly recommend that don't be afraid to jump over that uncomfortable hurdle of sending that email. Like, maybe as a result of today, you might have someone in mind, so you think, oh, you know what? I'll just hit send. I've already written the email in my head. I already know what I'm going to say. I just need to get it on paper and hit send. That's something I would really encourage.
Yeah, that absolutely. I think everyone that works within healthcare, or even people around us, are all incredibly friendly, and they want to support you. And this is how I found Liam as well. I was sending out a bunch of emails looking for speakers to come and talk to our projects, and you have kindly agreed. All been really positive. The responses have been incredibly kind, and I think if there's anything that you're interested in, I think the worst that can happen is they could not reply to your email. It's not really going to
You're
affect
right.
you too much, but I'm sure potential benefits are endless. Liam, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges in medicine today?
Big question. I think something that we're feeling acutely, particularly in general practice, is that also patient demand seems to be growing and growing, and there are some very sort of sensible reasons for that. We have an aging population. We have a population who are now developing more and more comorbidities, and therefore that the healthcare that they seek and the healthcare that they need is greater than maybe it was a number of years ago. That in and of itself is a challenge. That's an even more of a challenge when you consider the past couple of years that we've been through in the pandemic, and how hard the workforce has been worked, and even more of a challenge when you consider that we would like to have more workforce in order to meet these growing demands. And what that sort of plays out on the ground is that the job is quite tough. It's in general practice, for example. People burn out as a result. People then reduce the hours that they work, or sometimes leave the profession entirely, very sadly. And then the job gets harder for the people who are still working. That is a big challenge. Everybody within the system, every clinician who is working wants to absolutely do their best for the patients. I firmly believe that. But there comes a point when you can only push yourself so hard. And that's a challenge that is sort of playing out across the system at the moment. I think I don't like dwelling on challenges. I like thinking about, okay, what are the opportunities that exist within these challenges? And for me, one of the biggest things, so within one of my roles, I spend a lot of time talking to junior doctors and talking to people who are coming through the system. And what I see is a bunch of really engaged, really enthused people who have got a real sort of openness to thinking about how we do things and how can we do things better. And I really feel that from our generation, and no doubt that's true of the the people we have in the room this evening and the people you sort of engage with more widely. So to me, that's really positive, and I have a lot of hope for I would class us as our generation of doctors who are coming through the system. And I think that there are a few things that we can do. So first and foremost, it comes back to that core. It comes back to that being the best doctor you can be. And you're no doubt all doing absolutely that already, studying hard for your exams, working hard in your placements. Having that solid clinical grounding really makes everything so much easier and so much smoother, particularly if you're thinking about doing other things alongside this as well. And secondly, again, another theme that we've talked about this evening, keep your eyes open in the areas within which you work. And that's absolutely true as a medical student too. You have a real different perspective coming into new placements very frequently. You bring a fresh pair of eyes to a situation. The medical student lens isn't necessarily, you would see different things to what a junior doctor sees, and you would see different things to what a consultant sees. But this lens is so important given all of the different experiences you bring from within different placements, beyond medicine, and also that fresh pair of eyes as well. Keeping your eyes open for room for improvement and things that you might want to take on and things that you might want to build that team of cheerleaders and people alongside you to get you there. That will improve the lives of your patients, yes, but also the lives of your colleagues and the people that you work alongside. So it's that sort of thing that gives me hope, really. Yes, there is a big challenge at the moment. We recognize that. But I do think us coming through as this generation with this open mindset, with this energy and enthusiasm, I think together we can probably go some way to tackling that and improving the care that we offer and the experience of our doctors and our teams and our wider healthcare professionals within the system.
Well, that was truly inspiring to see that you've got so much hope for not only so many ideas, not only for improving healthcare, but for bringing about change and making the working environment better for current doctors and medical students as well. I think that's really such a positive spirit that we can all learn something from. Do you think there's anything that the medical profession and medical students can do to help address that?
Yeah, good question. I think it comes back to those two sort of almost key principles. I mean, that sort of being a good doctor, being the best doctor that you can be. That's ultimately the way that you're going to impact the person in front of you, the patient in front of you, that in the best way that you can. So that's really key. And then secondly, it's thinking about the patient firstly, and then secondly, thinking a bit beyond the patient. So what are my eyes open to some of this wider system stuff? Are we working as effectively as a ward as we possibly can? Is my practice running things in a way that I think is sort of smooth and efficient? And keeping your eyes open, if you spot some of these challenges, then take it one step further. Think about how might we fix these if we had a bit of time, we had a bit of energy, in some cases a bit of money. What might we do a bit differently? And there are so many sort of tangible things that you can do at a very local level within your placements that could be really powerful, from just coming and keeping that open mind, spotting that room for improvement and going ahead and seeing what you can do to make that change.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I think we've gone a bit over time, but we do have a few more minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask Liam, feel free to type it in the chat, or if you're comfortable, feel free to unmute and ask the questions directly. Whilst we're waiting for that, Liam, you mentioned being faculty of medical leadership and management, and the sort of organization that supports medical leadership. And having worked as a fellow previously, are there any opportunities that are aware of that medical students can get involved in, or anywhere that people can find a bit more information about medical leadership in general?
That's a great place to start with questions. So let me just bring up on a link to post in chat. So this is the FMLM, the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management. They are almost the sort of the go-to for things like setting standards for leadership. So what should leadership look like within healthcare? And as by extension, they have a lot of programs. They have a lot of things that you can get involved in at all stages of your career. So within that, there's a lot of educational resources on that website, but there's also specifically, I know they ran a FMLM medical student elective program. So for people who are thinking about what to do for their elective, maybe some time away for many of you, FMLM offer this elective scheme where it's similar to my fellowship, but just a shorter period of time. I think it was 6 weeks, if I remember rightly, where they will take medical students and they will put them into these national organizations for 6 weeks. So I had a brilliant student, Abby, who I worked alongside on some thinking about primary care workforce and how we can improve the offer for our workforce. So that's a specific thing that you might want to take a look at. The second thing as well, I don't know whether this will be mentioned in your previous sessions. One thing I took a lot from early in my career is a program called the Edward Jenner program. It's free. It's offered by the NHS Leadership Academy. So if you literally jump onto Google and type in Edward Jenner program, it's around a sort of 50-hour course that you can do in your own time, but it's designed for healthcare professionals. It's very accessible. It's a very solid introduction to leadership and what it means to be a leader, and importantly, lots of self-reflection on what it's like to be on the receiving end of me. What do my team and the people I work alongside think it's like to work with me? There's lots of this. I found that really helpful. And at the end of it, you also get a certificate to say, you know what, I'm interested in leadership. I've spent 50 hours or whatever the program is, trying to develop myself as a leader. And that in itself can be quite powerful as well. Spotted a few questions coming in, so I'll stop there.
Great, yeah, no, thank you so much. There's plenty of resources, FLMN, the Edward Jenner program, which is free to sign up if you have a university or NHS email address. I'm working through it at the moment, would totally recommend. There's a lot of useful information for finding ways to improve yourself as a leader. We've got a question here. Thank you for all your advice. I'm interested in GP with a leadership role and possibly education too. How does it work with finding opportunities for the paid leadership roles on a days you're not in clinical practice? I.e., do you apply for part-time GP specialty training and then find opportunities?
Yeah, so really good question, Eleanor, absolutely. So when you'll hopefully you'll join us in GP training. Strongly recommend it. It would be great to see you. What happens as a result? What are the practicalities? So I started GP training. I started as a full-time trainee, and within the first few months, I started seeing these fellowship opportunities pop up. They're advertised by the deanery. So for me, it was in East of England. And they're often 1 day a week, 2 day a week, paid roles by the deanery to do some specific pieces of work and some projects. So mine was around leadership education. So I built a platform with lots of resources on that people can go to and access some of this leadership development. There's also leadership in education opportunities. There's a whole host of opportunities there. So when you apply to training and you start training in an area, as I say, you generally start full time, and then you'll spot these opportunities that you can apply to. These opportunities go right the way through to full-time opportunities for a full year out of training, which is one of the FMLM's National Medical Director Fellowships that I did last year. So I think my advice on that would be, you don't need to, I wouldn't apply for part-time training first and then try and find these opportunities. It's almost you if you want to work full-time, you apply to full-time training, seek out the opportunities, and then negotiate with your deanery and your training program about how you're going to balance your clinical commitments alongside that. GP specifically is a really good specialty to go into, I think, if you're interested in doing other things alongside. So it's probably one of the most flexible specialties where you can work 2 or 3 days a week, even as a trainee, to try and explore some of these wider things, whether that's leadership, whether that's education, whether that's research. So that's quite a big draw for many people to general practice. You're welcome.
So, so what do you feel is the difference between public health and leadership?
Really good question. So I see why we're making that connection, because I spoke about leadership being stepping outside the consulting room and thinking about what happens beyond, and that essentially is public health. So I think a lot of what public health do is leadership. So public health, there's a lot of developing guidance. There's a lot of looking at what's happening in a community, say, oh, how many fast food outlets we have on the high street, and how does that map to things like deprivation? Are we exacerbating health inequalities by what we offer as a community? So I think ultimately, there isn't a lot of difference for me between public health and leadership. A lot of what public health do is leading other people within the system, whether that be in some cases general practices, in some cases hospitals, but also local authorities, sometimes voluntary and community sector organizations. Public health is a lot of that leadership, almost to steer them in a direction that they think is best for public health. So I think rather than there being a big difference between the two, I think they're inextricably linked. So public health is leadership, but isn't the entirety of leadership. There's lots of other bits of leadership in there, whether that's in primary care at general practice, whether that's in secondary care. So public health isn't the only place for leadership, but it's a real key place for it, I think.
Awesome. And we have another question on pay restoration. And I think this is in reference to the BMA campaign, or I think there's a campaign to restore junior doctor pay to how it was in 2008. The general message is that since then, because of how the pay hasn't been keeping up with inflation, there's been almost a 30% reduction in wages. Do you have any thoughts on that, Leo?
Yeah, no, brilliant question, and it's front and center of a lot of people's mind right now. I can probably reflect the views that I've heard from, as I say, I spend a lot of time with trainees and early career GPs, and there is a real issue with how much they feel valued. We hear it a lot that they go into work, they work incredibly hard day in, day out, and they don't necessarily feel that they're valued for that. And I think there are a few elements to that. So firstly, I think there's pay. And when you look at the figures, with the almost 30% reduction over the past number of years in what we're paid, are we worth 30% less than is the value that we provide 30% less than previously? I don't think so. And we know that pay is a really important way to make people feel valued. So I think that's very strong. I very much hear that and support that. I think that taking the question more broadly, there's a wider part about feeling valued as well. And I think money and pay is really, really important, but I don't want that to be the only thing. I'm really passionate about the working conditions and what our working days look like as well. And what I see sort of play out often is that, oh, it's either one or the other. You can't do both. When actually, I think it's both that are so important. It's pay and it's these conditions. It's being part of a value team. It's not having workload that is so over and above what should be expected in order for you to provide safe care. I don't think we should be separating these things out. I think it's both, and we should be striving for both along the same path.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to pop that in the chat. But if there isn't any, if nobody else, if that's everything, thank you so much, Liam, for coming and talking about your experiences today. And thank you for everyone at home as well for giving up an hour of your Wednesday evening to come and listen to this talk. I hope it was informative, and we'll be sending out some forms for feedback and certificates after the event. We'd be really grateful if you could fill this in to let us know how we've done and what we can do to improve.
Fantastic. Thank you for a great evening, and good to meet you all, and all the best. I hope our paths cross again soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.